Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on Somaliland and its quest for recognition.
Hmm.
You might have heard some things about this, especially from certain experts on the Horn of Africa.
Right.
But let's just say we're offering a different perspective here, one that digs a little deeper and uncovers some overlooked truths.
Yeah.
So have you ever even heard of Somaliland?
That's a great question.
Well, get ready, because this is going to be a journey through history and geography and some serious geopolitics.
The story usually told about Somaliland, it usually centers around Ethiopia and Somalia,
Right.
but that's really just a small part of the story.
Mm.
We really need to rewind,
Okay.
like way back, further than most analysts even care to go,
All right. I'm intrigued. Where are we going in this history lesson?
to the Adal Sultanate and the Abyssinian Empire.
Okay.
These two powers, they were constantly clashing for centuries.
Mm.
And that's the foundation, the real historical context that shaped the region long before any modern borders were drawn.
So are you saying the relationship between Somaliland and Ethiopia runs deeper than what we see on, like, current events and news?
Exactly. And that history is actually key to understanding what's happening today.
Okay.
Like, take the recent Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia.
Right.
This isn't just some out-of-the-blue agreement.
Mm.
It's rooted in centuries of interaction and conflict and cooperation between, the descendants of these two empires.
So we've got this deep historical connection, but here's what I find really interesting.
Okay.
Doesn't this also challenge that common idea that, like, European colonialism is what divided the Somali people?
You hit the nail on the head. This whole narrative of Europeans swooping in and dividing some unified people is just not accurate.
Mm.
Somaliland and Somalia have always had their own distinct historical and geographical identities.
Okay.
Somaliland, descending from the Adal Sultanate, they had a totally different trajectory than Somalia, which came from the Ajuran Sultanate.
So they were essentially never a single unified entity.
Correct. Precisely. And colonization obviously had its impact, for sure.
Right.
But it didn't create these divisions. In
Mhm.
fact, the impact played out differently in each region.
Okay.
Italian colonization in Somalia was much more disruptive, while the British presence in Somaliland was much lighter.
Right.
They left a lot of the existing clan-based political structures intact.
Okay, so history is important, but what about the geography?
Yes.
You mentioned that this is often overlooked as well.
If you can visualize a population density map of the Horn of Africa,
Okay.
what do you see?
I see a lot of different colors and things.
Well, there's this dense population stretch that runs from Berbera in Somaliland all the way to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia.
Hmm.
And that route is much shorter and more populated than the one connecting Somalia to Addis Ababa, which is mostly desert.
So from a purely geographical standpoint, Ethiopia's strategic interest in Somaliland's port of Berbera makes perfect sense.
Exactly. And this really begs the question,
With that,
why are we so focused on these diplomatic statements and frameworks like the Ankara process, when the actual geographic and economic realities point in a completely different direction?
Now, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the claim that Somaliland broke away from Somalia in 1991.
Right.
How does that fit into all of this?
Honestly, that framing is fundamentally flawed. To say Somaliland's story starts in 1991 ignores its history going all the way back to 1960.
Okay.
Somaliland's claim isn't about secession. It's about continuing the state that existed before this whole problematic union.
I think some people might be a little confused by that. Can you break it down for us?
Think about the Baltic states separating from the Soviet Union.
Okay.
That union was considered illegal, so the Baltic states simply reclaimed the sovereignty they already had. In a very similar way, the union between Somaliland and Somalia, it was troubled from the very beginning.
Troubled how?
Well, the very first act of union was never actually ratified.
Oh, wow.
And when they tried to push through another act of union with a referendum,
The people of Somaliland straight up rejected it.
wow.
And then you have a coup happening right after this attempted union,
Right.
which eventually escalated into the horrific Isaac genocide.
So legally speaking, Somaliland and Somalia never truly merged in the first place.
Exactly. There's a principle in international law. Illegal actions can't create legal rights.
Right.
Genocide, a forced union, and missing a valid act of union, none of that legitimizes claims over Somaliland.
Right.
That's why many argue this is a case of state continuity, much like the Baltic states.
Okay.
It's not secession, it's reclaiming what was always theirs.
Wow, there's so much more to this than meets the eye. So if Somaliland has such a strong case, where does the African Union stand on all of this? I thought they were the key to recognition.
There's this idea that the African Union has always had the final say on recognition.
Right.
But that's not entirely true.
Okay.
Like, for example, under President George W. Bush, the United States was actually pushing for Somaliland's independence.
Really? Had no idea. It's true. And Jende Fraser, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, she even said that, looking back, they shouldn't have deferred to the African Union on this.
Interesting. So other major powers have considered recognizing Somaliland independent of the African Union's position.
Absolutely. And it's not just the U.S.
Right.
You have to consider China's stance on Taiwan and Somaliland's relationship with Taiwan.
Okay.
There are a lot of global dynamics at play here. It's much bigger than just waiting for the African Union to make a decision.
It sounds like Somaliland has been playing a very strategic game, even without formal recognition.
They have. Somaliland has consistently taken a give-and-take approach. Since signing that Memorandum of Understanding with Ethiopia,
Right.
they've made some serious gains without really giving up anything substantial. Look at Somalia. They went and sold 30% of their marine resources to Turkey without any guarantee that it would counter the Ethiopia-Somaliland deal.
So Somaliland is making moves, forging alliances, getting things done, all without being formally recognized.
Exactly. Even Ethiopian state media hinted that a future U.S. administration might recognize Somaliland,
Oh, wow.
particularly after the Ankara Declaration.
Okay.
This shows that analyses focusing solely on the African Union's position, they're missing the bigger picture.
And what exactly was the Ankara Declaration?
Think of it as a timeout, a temporary diplomatic pause to manage tensions in the region. While the transition from AMISOM to ATMIS, the African Union mission in Somalia, is completed.
So not a permanent roadblock for Somaliland.
Exactly. And Somaliland's advocates have been incredibly smart about this. They've avoided rushing into any agreements, and they're watching how the global political landscape shifts. They're really playing the long game.
Waiting for the perfect moment to make their move.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
And their strategy has been working. Some narratives out there, they paint Somaliland as the loser in this whole geopolitical chess match.
Right.
But they've actually turned the tables more than once.
Do you have an example?
Sure. Somalia tried to exert some authority by expelling Ethiopia's ambassador from Mogadishu.
Okay.
And they tried to force the removal of the ambassador to Hargeisa.
Okay.
They failed.
So even without being officially recognized, Somaliland is standing its ground, challenging Somalia's attempts to, control the situation.
Exactly. The MOU with Ethiopia is a perfect example.
Right.
It proves that Somalia can't really stop countries from recognizing Somaliland. Their efforts to undermine the agreement actually backfired,
Oh, wow.
highlighting how much Somalia depends on foreign troops to even deal with al-Shabaab.
Right.
This actually made Somaliland's position even stronger.
You know, it sounds like Somaliland might be quietly winning the PR battle, too.
The numbers back that up. After the MOU, global interest in Somaliland just exploded. Google Trends shows searches for Somaliland hitting record highs.
Wow.
Even more interesting is how the conversation has changed. It's no longer, where is Somaliland?
Right.
Now, it's recognizing Somaliland makes sense, and it's long overdue.
Mm.
Support among both Western publics and elites is at an all-time high.
So Somaliland is gaining visibility, momentum, and support globally, all without that official stamp of recognition.
That's right. And this brings us to a crucial point that often gets lost in all the geopolitical talk.
Okay.
The human cost of ignoring Somaliland's rightful claims.
Let's talk about that. What are the real risks here?
People are quick to point out these geopolitical risks and potential conflicts if Somaliland gets recognized.
Right.
But what about the risks that the people of Somaliland face every day because they are denied recognition?
What kind of risks are we talking about?
Think about the lack of proper health care. Women are dying from preventable complications because Somaliland doesn't have the resources or recognition to build a strong healthcare system. These are the real tangible costs that get ignored in all these grand geopolitical discussions.
So the real risk isn't some abstract geopolitical conflict. It's the suffering of real people denied basic services and opportunities.
Exactly. The African Union's own fact-finding mission, they highlighted this human cost, but those aren't the risks that are making headlines.
It's easy to get caught up in the theoretical arguments, but we can't forget that real people's lives are at stake.
And that's why framing Somaliland's case as secession is so harmful. It distracts from these real issues and perpetuates a narrative that hurts the people of Somaliland.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm seeing Somaliland's story in a whole new light.
It's a complex story, often misrepresented.
Right.
But it's a story that deserves to be heard and understood.
We've covered a lot of ground, and this is just the beginning. Stay tuned as we continue to explore this fascinating story.
Great.
What are the broader implications of Somaliland's story for the region and the international community?
Well, there's this persistent misconception that Somaliland's recognition would automatically lead to more conflict and instability in the Horn of Africa.
Why do you think people believe that?
I think it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation on the ground.
Okay.
Somaliland has been effectively exercising external sovereignty for over 3 decades. They're forging agreements, they're engaging with international actors, they have friends and foes, just like any other nation, based on shared interests.
So you're saying Somaliland's already a player on the geopolitical stage?
Absolutely. Recognition wouldn't fundamentally change that.
Okay.
It would just formalize those existing relationships.
So instead of creating new conflicts, recognizing Somaliland would simply acknowledge the realities that already exist.
Precisely. This idea that recognizing Somaliland would somehow unleash chaos is simply a fallacy. It's like saying, don't acknowledge the truth.
Yeah.
The longer the world ignores this key player in the region, the more distorted the situation becomes.
So by refusing to acknowledge Somaliland, we're actually making the problem worse.
In a way, yeah. We're delaying the inevitable and potentially creating more tension in the long run. The more pragmatic approach is to ask, will recognizing Somaliland, despite its complexities and potential challenges, ultimately lead to a more stable and prosperous region?
That is a question worth considering.
And it's a question that requires us to move beyond the simplistic narratives and really grapple with the nuances of the situation.
This is where the concept of realism in international relations comes into play, right?
Yes.
We have to acknowledge the realities on the ground and make decisions based on what is, not what we wish it to be.
Exactly. And that means acknowledging Somaliland's effective sovereignty,
Okay.
its role in the regional dynamics, and its legitimate aspirations for statehood.
And as you mentioned earlier, it also means acknowledging the human cost of delaying this recognition.
Absolutely. The people of Somaliland have waited long enough. It's time for the international community to recognize their rights and give them the opportunity to build a brighter future.
This has been a fascinating and eye-opening discussion.
Thanks.
We've challenged some of the prevailing narratives about Somaliland, delved into the historical and geopolitical complexities of its case, and really explored the human dimension of this ongoing struggle for recognition.
It's a story that deserves far more attention and understanding than it typically receives.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has sparked your curiosity, that it's challenged your assumptions, and that it's inspired you to keep engaging with Somaliland's story even after this episode ends.
There's always more to learn, more to uncover, and more to do.
This is The Deep Dive signing off.